Welcome to our discussion on genetics. Genetics is a really fascinating topic that hopefully you've read the terms in your reading assignment and you're a little bit more familiar with those right now. So we're going to really jump into what is it that we can do using genetics that would be useful or interesting. And one of those is predicting outcomes of what kind of kid are you going to get based on the parents. What kinds of traits are they going to have based on what the parents had and what the parents could contribute? So the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that determines whether a particular expression of a trait is dominant or recessive? And that usually can be done by looking around to see what trait is most commonly exhibited. Is brown hair more common than blonde? Are blue eyes less common than brown eyes? And typically looking at the average expression across the population will tell you. When we actually write these out for a genetics problem, what we're going to do is write them out based on allele combos. Remember, an allele is a contribution for a trait from mom and from dad, giving each individual two alleles. So one individual might have, let's say, one of these different genotypes. So a genotype is basically the set of alleles that the individual has. And these are the three different combinations that you can have. This combo right here is called a homozygous dominant. Homozygous means they're both the same. Dominant tells you that both of them, being the same, happen to be dominant. And we use capital letters to represent dominant alleles and lowercase letters to represent recessive alleles. So, homozygous dominant. Our middle option here is heterozygous. And by definition, heterozygous means one of each. So it has a dominant allele and a recessive allele. Our third possibility here is called a homozygous recessive because they're both the same and they're both recessive. Now, one key thing to point out here is what is going to be expressed. So you'll recall from your reading assignment that genotype is the code. So big A, little a, or little a, those are the genotypes. The phenotype is what you actually see. So what would you see from a genotype of big A? And let's say that that's talking about something like whatever you want. And you can pick whatever letters you want to represent a particular trait, as long as you're consistent throughout the options. The only time you have to use a particular letter combination is when you're talking about gender, and gender would be for a female, XX, and for a male, XY. So that's the only time you have to use a particular set of letters. So let's change our letter sets here so it will make a little bit more sense for something real, because A by itself doesn't necessarily, in my mind, represent with any particular thing. Let's use H's here. And in my mind, H would stand for hair color. H for hair, in my mind, makes sense. So as long as, again, we keep track of it, it's okay. So let's get rid of our gender for now. We'll come back to that later. And so let's say this is hair color. And if we look around a particular population, and hair color is one of those things that discriminates based on ethnicity. So if we look at African Americans, the dominant hair color is black. If we look at Hispanic, the dominant hair color is black. If we look at Asian, the dominant hair color is black. If we look at European, then we introduce more options. In this case, we introduce that brown hair is the most common. So let's just say now that brown hair is dominant for our discussion here, and just keep in mind which individual you're talking about might vary a little bit. So in this case, where it is homozygous dominant, so the genotype is homozygous dominant. The phenotype is going to be brown hair, because there are only brown hair alleles present. Big H means brown hair. In our middle example here for heterozygous, our phenotype would still be brown hair, because there is a brown-haired allele present. As long as that dominant allele is present, the recessive allele is there, but not expressed. Down here in our homozygous recessive condition, the expression here is going to be blonde. And we're going to say blonde, but keep in mind it really could be anything, any hair color other than the dominant. So it could be red hair, it could be blonde hair, it could be black hair in this particular case. But the recessive, so the only way to have a recessive phenotype, so have that recessive allele actually be expressed, is in this homozygous recessive condition. Either of these other two, because a dominant allele is present, the dominant allele will be expressed, the recessive allele will be ignored. So let's look at how we can actually apply this. What would you like to know about a kid's hair color? Would you like to know what the possibilities are of your children having any particular hair color? And there are lots of other traits you can do this for as well. We're just on hair color right now. So to do this, we would need what we call a Punnet square. And basically this allows us to do a little bit of probability math and figure out what the odds of a child having a particular outcome would be. So let's say this is Daddy. And let's say this is Mama. Daddy is going to contribute one of these alleles to each of the offspring, and Mama is going to contribute one of her alleles to each of these offspring. And it's completely random. We don't know which ones will be contributed until you actually see the baby come out. So what we have to do is account for all possible combinations. Daddy could contribute this big H, so we'll put it right here. Daddy could instead contribute this big H. We'll put it right here. So here's Daddy's possible contributions. If we take Mama and plug her into the top, she could contribute this dominant allele, or she could contribute the recessive allele. So here's Mama's contribution. Now to figure out what the babies would be, we take Daddy. So if Daddy contributed this big H and Mama contributed this big H, the resulting baby would be big H, which we would call homozygous dominant. If Daddy contributes this big H and Mama instead contributes this little h, the resulting offspring would be big H, little h, and we would call that heterozygous. If Daddy contributed this other big H instead, with Mama's big H, we would get another homozygous dominant offspring. If Daddy contributed this big H with Mama's little h, we get another heterozygous child. So everything Daddy has will combine with everything Mama has in every combination, and what the Punnet square does is gives us all of the possible combinations that could come about from that father and that mother. So here we have, of our 4 kids in this theoretical scenario, we have 2 homozygous dominant and 2 heterozygous. So that tells us what possible children could come from that. We can then derive some ratios from this, and the first is the genotypic ratio. The genotypic ratio has 3 numbers in it, and the first number is the number of homozygous dominant children that were in your Punnet square. So how many homozygous dominant children do we have here? How many big H children were there? And your answer should be, well, there's 1 and there's 2. So there are 2 homozygous dominant children. The second number in a genotypic ratio is the number of heterozygous. So how many heterozygous children were in this square? Your answer is also 2. The third number in a genotypic ratio is the number of homozygous recessive, in this case little h. There are none of those, so that gets a 0. So the genotypic ratio for this particular set of kids and parents is 2 to 2 to 0, telling you 2 of them are homozygous dominant, 2 were heterozygous, and 2 were, or rather 0, were homozygous recessive. We can calculate a second ratio from this, and this is the phenotypic ratio. In that case, that's the number of dominant traits to the number of recessive traits. So in this case, we're going to say brown was our dominant trait, and just generically, blonde was the recessive. So how many of these children would have been brown hair? all of them had the dominant brown allele present, so they all expressed brown hair. That means none of them expressed the recessive trait. So from all of these Punnet squares that you could do, you can calculate these two ratios. Now this was a particularly boring set of parents really, so let's change some of our starting information and see how that changes the end result. And let's change Daddy. Let's make Daddy heterozygous, so there's a big H and a little h. And we'll go ahead and work this square and see what outcome we get. So this H and this H gives us homozygous dominant. This H and this H gives us heterozygous. If Daddy contributed this little h to Mama's big H, we would get that. If Daddy contributed this little h to Mama's little h, we would get that. So you can see here that we have some different outcomes now in our Punnet square. So let's calculate our genotypic and phenotypic ratios now. So in this square, how many homozygous dominant kids do we have? We have one. The second number in the genotypic ratio was our heterozygous, so how many heterozygous kids do we have? 2. Our third number was the number of homozygous recessives, and we actually have one of those now. So our genotypic ratio is now 1 to 2 to 1. If we look at our phenotypic ratio, how many brown-haired kids did we get? 1, 2, 3. And how many blonde kids did we get? We got one of those. So our phenotypic ratio is now 3 to 1. Just by changing one of the starting ingredients here, we got a significant difference in our outcomes. Now I have mentioned that the only way to get a recessive trait expressed is to have both alleles be recessive. That would mean back when Daddy was our homozygous dominant, big H, because Dad had no recessive allele available to contribute, that meant he was never going to father a recessive haired child. If we look at this a different way, because Daddy had to have that little H to pass on to get the homozygous recessive, if he didn't have it, then it wasn't possible. But let's look at a little bit different scenario here that really tells us the same thing. Let's make Daddy blonde-haired. Let's say Mama blonde-haired. And fill out our Punnet square. If you're paying attention here, you'll see that we took this little h and this little h made this child. This little h and this little h made this child. This little h and this little h made this child. And then we have this child, which if you're really paying attention and thinking about this, you have some hand raising, you have some question marks going on as to where did this big H come from when there wasn't a big H available in the gene pool. Often students will say, well, maybe it came from grandma or grandpa or somewhere farther back in the family tree, but if it wasn't present in Daddy and it wasn't present in Mama, it can't be present in baby. It cannot come from somewhere that's not there in the parents. So if the parents didn't have it in their genotype, then it can't show up in the babies. Which means this. In the olden days, we would have given this a different title. I'm going to label this a little bit more modern-like. That this particular big H was a result of perhaps the Amazon Prime delivery man. In the olden days, we would have blamed it on the milkman because they came around to the house every day for more milk. Nowadays, it's more like an Amazon delivery person, so that big H came from somewhere other than this particular set of parents. So that means that Mama, because she was there to give birth, clearly was a part of that equation, but in this case, Daddy had nothing to do with this child right here. Hopefully that makes sense. So if we said that the only way to get blonde was to have both of those alleles recessive, and if there are only recessive alleles in the gene pool, that means you must get all recessive children, if that is truly the source of the gene pool. So 2 blonde-haired parents, a brown-haired child cannot make. Now sometimes people start asking questions and questioning their own existence based on, well, I'm this, my parents are that, is that possible? And the answers are sometimes yes, sometimes no. But if both of your parents are blonde, and you are biologically the child of that set of parents, then you're blonde. If both of your parents are blonde and you're brown-haired, then you came from somewhere else. Doesn't mean you don't belong, just means that you originated biologically from some other combination. Well, let's do a little bit of theoretical work here. And let's talk about eye color. In the world of eye color, it's technically a little bit more complicated than what we've been doing here, but we're going to, for our purposes, make it as simple as it really could be. And I'm going to use E for eye color. E for eye in my world makes sense. So here are 3 possible genotypes that we could have in a parent. So let's consider me. I have blue eyes. If you're aware of other people's eye color, you will perhaps know that blue eyes are the recessive eye color. And we're going to go ahead and say that green and blue are genetically the same thing here, just differing amounts of pigment. So I have blue eyes. We just said that's recessive. So which one of these 3 genotypes must I be? The answer is this. I must be homozygous recessive to express the recessive eye color. So there's me. My wife has brown eyes. So which one of these 3 genotypes could my wife be? This genotype would give us brown eyes because both alleles are the dominant brown eye allele. This heterozygous could also give us brown eyes because we have a brown-eyed allele present and a blue-eyed allele, but the brown as the dominant will be expressed. So which one of these is my wife? When you don't know, sometimes you can go back a generation and maybe or maybe not figure it out. So let's go back and consider my wife's parents. My wife's mother is brown-eyed, so that tells us that she is one of these 2. My wife's father was blue-eyed, which means he had to have been the homozygous recessive. So we know what daddy was, and we know mama could have been one of these 2. My wife, being brown-eyed, must have a dominant allele present, so she must have a big E. Because her dad did not have a big E to contribute, we know the big E came from her mom. Because dad only had little e's to contribute, she must have one of those little e's. So to be brown-eyed and be the daughter of her father, she has to be heterozygous. Because dad only had little e's to contribute, mom contributed a big E to make her blue-eyed, so that means my wife's genotype would be heterozygous. Plugs into the Punnet square this way. So what we're trying to figure out is what the eye color of my children could be. So if I contributed this little e, mama contributed this big E, we would get that. If I contributed this big E, the little e rather, and mama contributed her little e, we would get that. Down here, my little e here with mama's big E, little e with little e. So there are the possibilities for my children. Now, that means that I have 2 out of 4 chances of my children having brown eyes and 2 out of 4 chances of my children having blue eyes. So that suggests a 50-50 chance there. In the world of genetics, I prefer you give your odds in a fraction form, and more specifically in a non-reduced fraction. So if I were telling you what the odds of my children were to be of having brown eyes, I would say 2 out of 4. That's much more informative than saying 50%, because the question is 50% of what? That's more informative than saying half, because again, the question is half of what? If I say 2 out of 4, that tells you everything, all in one statement. So 2 out of 4 odds of having a brown-eyed child, 2 out of 4 odds of having a blue-eyed child. For my first child, she was born, and after she was a couple months old, eye color became clear, and she was this. So she was a brown-eyed child. So we said the odds were 2 out of 4 of having the brown-eyed child. What are the odds of my second child being brown-eyed? The answer is also 2 out of 4. As long as the starting ingredients don't change, then the odds of any particular outcome don't change either. So you don't use up options in the gene pool here. So my second child came along with the odds of 2 out of 4 being brown-eyed, and that child was actually this. So I have a brown-eyed child and a blue-eyed child. I have one of each, and that's all you can ask for. So this was an example of not only looking at eye color, but also considering the idea of missing pieces. So sometimes if you have missing pieces to the puzzle, you can look at the generation before that and sometimes fill in those missing pieces. Or if I gave you some of these things here in the outcomes, then you could come back and tell me what the parents perhaps would have had to be based on those. If we consider gender, and you can take this concept here, and sometimes this is called a mono-hybrid cross. We're looking at one trait at a time in that Punnet square. So you can do that for a lot of different traits. So as we said, hair color, eye color, curly hair, straight hair, hair on certain sections of a finger, not on other sections, widow's peak or straight hairline, and the list really goes on and on for things that can be determined that way. But let's consider gender. And remember we said that gender was very specific. You have to use X's and Y's. So XX is the female, XY is the male. And in society these days, there's a lot of debate and discussion about what is gender and what determines gender and what does gender mean. And really biologically it's quite simple. If a Y chromosome is present, that individual is biologically male. End of conversation. If there is no Y chromosome present, that individual is female. End of conversation. So there's no debate, there's no discussion, there's no question in the world of biology as to what determines gender. It's simple. Y chromosome is male, no Y chromosome, regardless what else is there, is female. So really the Y chromosome is the distinguishing factor. So if we take mama and plug her in, she can contribute an X. Daddy could contribute an X or a Y. So we'll say this, all eggs are X eggs. Sperm come in both X sperm and Y sperm. So what we want to know now is what are the odds of having any particular gender. So if we do our math here, this X and this X with this X, this Y with this X, this Y with this X. So what we've determined now is that there is a 2 out of 4 or a 50% chance of having a girl or a boy. So the odds of both of those are the same. But if we look at society, it doesn't usually add up to a true 50-50 split of both genders. And the answer for why is that is actually quite simple. When we look at our incoming contributions, we have 1 Y and 3 votes for X. So the gene pool to start with making a baby is 75% female, 25% male, which then suggests that the female to male ratio should be 75 female, 25 male. It's not 50-50, it's not 75-25, but if you split the difference between those two, that's about where it comes out. So we can say, and guys, pay attention, this is the one time where we can definitively prove that we have the final say in anything. Male contribution determines gender. See, mama's biased. She always votes for a girl. Daddy, statistically speaking, can vote for a girl half the time and for a boy half the time, but whatever sperm Daddy happens to contribute that fertilizes the egg determines the gender. End of story. So Daddy determines gender. But perhaps you know some families that have, let's say, 4, 5, 6 kids, and they're all one gender. They're all boys, or they're all girls. And we said here that mathematically we should end up somewhere around 55% female, 45% male, somewhere in that ballpark anyway. But here we have 4, 5, 6 kids in a row, all with that same gender. It seems statistically unlikely. So let's do the math. The odds of one child being any particular gender, we would say, would be 2 out of 4. For the sake of mathematical simplicity, we're going to go ahead and reduce the fraction here, so we've got the odds being 1/2. It's numbers that are a little bit easier to work with. So the odds of any one gender is 1/2. What are the odds of a second child being that same gender? Well, the odds didn't change because our input didn't change. The odds of that one are 1/2. So what are the odds, let's say, of 3 kids in a row being the same gender? We actually multiply these together to get our answer, and we actually get 1/8. So there's 1 in 8 chance of having 3 children born in a row of the same gender. So we've said maybe these families with 4, 5, 6 kids all have the same gender, and that seems like the odds would be even longer. So let's take a look at that. Let's clear off this other stuff here. This problem gets a little bigger. And I know of a family, actually, that had, making those way too big, a number of children all the same gender. It was quite confusing until you understood the math. So we said 1/2 here. So let's do the odds of, in this case, 5 kids in a row, same gender, or let's just say 5 kids in a family all being the same gender. What's the odds of that? If we multiply everything together, we get our odds here are 1 in 32 of having all 5 kids be, let's say, male, female didn't matter. So the odds are 1 in 32. Now that seems like pretty slim odds, but you've known of this happening several times over in your life experience perhaps, so there's got to be something to it other than random chance. So let's take this a little bit farther with the specific example that comes to mind for me. I know a family who now has, I believe it's 7 kids. That's a lot. In the homeschooling community, there are a lot of families with lots of kids. But in this particular case, we'll look at this. So we said the odds of 1 being something, and for this particular case, the first was female. The second was female. The third was female. The fourth was female. The fifth was female. And at some point, they started explaining their continued production of children by saying, we're trying for a boy. If it were me, at some point I would give up and say, I just don't get it. It's going to be the way it is, but they really wanted the boy apparently, so they kept going. And so we've already determined the odds of this are 1 in 32. So realistically, if you've gotten this 1 in 32 card you've drawn, what are the odds the next one's going to be a boy? Not really good. But they tried again because they really wanted that boy, and here's what they got. And I guess I should say that I believe at least one of these 5 sets in here, at least 2 of them were accounted for by being twins, but we still have multiple pregnancies here attempting for a boy. So we've got 5 kids already. We try again. This one happens to be, again, the odds are still going to be 1/2 for each one of those. This was a 2-for-1 special, or twins, and thank goodness for everyone involved, that one turned out to be boys. So they had 5 girls, 2 boys, and those 2 boys were only really because they happened to have twins, both of them probably coming from that same male sperm. So what this would mean then, and what would explain this, is that we said the male could produce 50% X and 50% Y, but there was no rule that said the male had to. So in these scenarios where child after child after child comes out the same gender, we're really looking at daddy as primarily producing that kind of sperm and not so much of the other. So if we look at this of 5 girl sperm, or let's say 4, one of these being a set of twins, 4 female sperm in a row, and finally 1 male sperm down here at the end for these twins, Daddy was probably producing mostly X sperm and not much in the way of Y sperm. So Daddy determined gender. So those families with multiple males, multiple females, and little to none of the other, probably Daddy producing mostly X or mostly Y and not much of the other. Now both of my children are girls. So in that particular case, that means both of the sperm involved in producing those eggs happen to be X sperm. But does 2 girls in a row mean that that's mostly what I'm producing? Or is that just a reasonable random chance outcome? Well, if the odds were half for each one, we had 2. The odds then are 1 in 4 of that happening, which are reasonable odds. Still a 25% chance of getting that particular outcome. So that by itself wouldn't necessarily suggest anything definitively about my sperm production at that point in life. You would probably have to have 3 in a row before you really started thinking that might be the case, and 4 or more in a row before that probably was the case. If you really want to know, you could get tested, but it's probably not worth it to the average person. Let's introduce the idea of a carrier. So a carrier is something that, let's say a particular disease, and let's say hemophilia is a disease carried as a carrier concept. And what that means is that it's a recessive disease. So it's something that you have to have the trait for it. Because it is on the recessive allele, you have to get that recessive allele from both parents, meaning the odds of transmitting it from one generation to the next perhaps go down. And let's just look at color blindness. That's another common one, more common than hemophilia. So if we've got mama, we've got daddy. Sex-linked traits are carrier traits that happen to be associated with a particular chromosome. So if I said that males often express sex-linked traits, but females only occasionally express sex-linked traits, which chromosome is it on? The X or the Y? Often in males, only occasionally in females. Because it's possible for a female to have this, it has to be on the X chromosome. The reason why males often get it is if this particular X happens to be faulty for color blindness, and the male only had one X, they have the problem. If a female happens to have a colorblind faulty X and a good X, and because only one of the 2 X's are used by females in the first place as part of what's called dosage compensation, or sometimes X chromosome inactivation, which means that the same amount of X chromosome material is expressed between the 2 genders. So if a female only has one faulty X and the other one's good, this X gets turned off using the good X. The male didn't have a backup X to use, so if it's faulty and he's out of luck. This means that for a female to express a sex-linked trait, both X's have to be faulty. That means mama's X and daddy's X were both faulty. And this leads us to another interesting scenario, sort of a Maury Povich type show almost, and that would be the question of who's the father. So let's say this. What if a normal vision father, so a normal vision father would be a healthy X and a Y, and then we also had a normal vision mama, and a normal vision mama can either be this, heterozygous, so one faulty, one good, or it can be both of them good, but both result in normal vision. Just for the fun of it, let's leave that in there for one faulty X. So a normal vision father with a normal vision mother give birth to a color-blind daughter. You're the judge. The father is suing the mother on the grounds of infidelity, saying, that's not my kid. I want divorced. I want out. She cheated on me. You're the judge. Okay? So daddy had normal vision, mama had normal vision, and they had a color-blind daughter. So the colorblind daughter has to be having both X's faulty. Now mama could be normal vision, but have a faulty X to be able to pass on to daughter. But to get a colorblind daughter, daddy also has to be colorblind himself. He has to have a faulty X to pass on as the second X, producing the homozygous recessive, in this case, the colorblind daughter. But since he was a normal vision father, his X contribution would have been normal, resulting in a normal vision daughter. So you as the judge would rule in favor of the dad. Mom cheated. Dad had nothing to do with that, and so he wins. Now, if dad was normal vision and mom was normal vision, and they give birth to a colorblind boy, you can't necessarily make that statement. So let's do the math here. Daddy, mama having the possibility of a colorblind X in there. And if we do our math here, we discover that it is possible for two normal vision parents to produce a colorblind boy. Because if one of mama's X's were faulty and she happened to contribute that one to this boy, which only got one, daddy contributed the Y, colorblind boy became possible from two parents that were normal vision. But a colorblind girl was never possible from two parents with colorblind vision. So for a colorblind daughter to occur, there must be a colorblind father involved. Mama could still be normal vision, heterozygous, but if daddy was colorblind, that would produce the odds or possibility of two colorblind X's getting together to form that offspring. So that's the concept of a carrier. In this particular case, someone who doesn't necessarily express the problem, but can pass it on to the offspring. So with sex-linked traits, females are carriers. For other things that might be found on other chromosomes other than the X and Y, then daddy might be able to be a carrier for that. But a person not expressing it, but able to pass it on to the next generation. Things like sickle cell disease, for example, is a carrier kind of scenario where you might not express the problem, but be able to pass it on to the next generation. So sometimes it's a silent problem that would only pop up every once in a while when the combination happened to hit just right. Let's consider one last idea here in this, and that is the idea of a dihybrid cross. We've done monohybrid crosses with one trait, but what if we have two traits? So let's say we want to know what's the odds of having a child born with a particular hair color and a particular eye color. Now we could do this by doing two separate monohybrid crosses and putting the information together. That's messy. I don't really feel like that's a good, dependable way to get the outcome. So here's what we're going to do instead. We're going to do a dihybrid cross, which is a little bigger. We actually have 16 kids in this particular Punnet Square. And let's say that, so we've got, let's say mama here and daddy here, and for right now, both mommy and daddy are exactly the same genotype. They're both heterozygous for both traits. Big H, big E, little e. So here's our hair, here's our eyes. Because they're both the same, let's just clear this out of the way. And here's the hard part of doing a dihybrid cross. Figuring out what contribution of H and E the parent is going to give to each particular child. So this individual could give a big H with a big E, so they're going to give one of each. That's one possibility. They could give that big H instead with little e. They could give a little h with a big E, or a little h with a little e. So those are the four different possible combinations of H and E alleles that that parent could put together. Because we said both parents were the same, we'll go ahead and just plug the same stuff across the top here. And so there's our Punnet square ready to go. Now we need to do the combination just like we did for the monohybrid cross, just with more stuff. So big H, big E plus big H, big E gives us big H, big H, big E, big E. So same idea, we just got bigger now. We're going to do the same thing for all the rest of the 15 kids here. And I'm going to go ahead and jump up here and do all this so you won't be able to see what I'm doing until I'm done. So enjoy looking at my back for a minute here while I fill out this square. And it might seem like I do it quickly. That's because I've been doing this for years. I can do it in my sleep, and I sometimes have, and that makes for really freaky dreams. Apologize for my bad sloppy handwriting here. As you know at this point, on a good day it's not good, but on this little miniature board here, it's extra clumsy. So there's all 16 of our kids, and you can see that there's a variety of different genotypes going on. So all kinds of different H and E combos there, and it looks like sort of a mess, and in some ways it sort of is. So you might need to pause at this point and go ahead and work out the rest of your Punnet square that you're writing down here to catch up. But it's the same principle. Again, just everything has two H's and two E's in it. Now we can compose a phenotypic and genotypic ratio just like we did for our other squares. This one just happens to be a little bit bigger. So our first number in a genotypic ratio is the homozygous dominant. In this case, it's big H, big E. So how many of the kids in this Punnet square have a big H and a big E present? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 9 of those kids were considered homozygous dominant, having both alleles have a dominant present. The second number in our genotypic ratio was the number of heterozygous. And this is where we deviate a little bit because there are two different kinds of heterozygous. We could have big H little e, or we could have little h big E. So how many of our remaining children that have not been crossed off yet have a big H and only little e? Remember, the dominant expresses if there's only one of the two. The recessive only expresses if they're both present. So how many have a big H and only little e's? 1, 2, and 3. Of the remaining children, how many have only little h's and a big E? 1, 2, 3. The last number in a genotypic ratio is the number of homozygous recessive. In this case, that's little h, little e. So how many of the remaining children only have little h and only have little e? There's only one kid left. It fits that description. So our genotypic ratio is 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. The phenotypic ratio, we don't have to count anything here. We take the numbers that are already here and we just convert the genotype into words that make sense. So in this case, dominant hair plus dominant eyes. So let's say dominant hair was brown, dominant eyes were brown. So that means we have 9 brown-haired, brown-eyed children. Big H little e means brown hair, blue eyes. So 3 were brown-haired, blue-eyed. Little h big E means blonde hair, brown eyes. So 3 blonde-haired, brown-eyed kids. And over here, 1 blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid. So So what we're looking at is the odds of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid coming from two parents who are brown-haired and brown-eyed is 1 in 16. So if the parents are expressing something that's dominant, they can pass on the recessive allele for that to an offspring. It's a possibility. But if the parents are expressing a recessive trait for that thing, that means they couldn't possibly have a dominant allele to pass on, and they won't do it. So dominant allele parents, or dominant trait parents, can produce recessive kids, but recessive parents can't produce dominant kids. As long as you keep that straight, a lot of this hopefully will make more sense. So this is a dihybrid cross, two traits at once. And that really wasn't too bad, and we get our answers as to what our odds of two different things happening at the same time would be. What if we want to know about three things at the same time? That would be called a trihybrid cross. And I'm not going to work one on this board because it wouldn't fit. A trihybrid cross has 64 kids in it, so 64 squares. And that would take me about a half hour to work to make sure I didn't get anything goofed up, and it wouldn't prove a whole lot to us. But in your book is a distribution chart of the different skin colors. So when we talk about skin color, there are 64 different genetic skin colors out there, plus the effect of the environment. So skin color is actually influenced by 3 different sets of alleles, combining together to produce that one outcome. And so again, there's absolute lack of pigment, would be an albino. Maximum pigment that could possibly be produced would be on the darkest end of the scale, and 62 different shades in between. So that means any particular family you look at might well have multiple different levels of skin pigment produced, not because they belong or don't belong to the family, but because they happen to fall somewhere on that spectrum of those 64 different options there. So skin color, even within families, is highly variable. Just because you have a lighter skinned child or a darker skinned child than what you or the other parent happens to be, doesn't necessarily mean they belong or don't belong. We're not talking here about African American parents having a Caucasian baby. That doesn't happen. But we're just talking about lighter or darker within this spectrum of whatever the ethnicity could allow for. So that would be a much bigger square than this. And working out the genotypic and phenotypic ratios for that would be quite interesting. In reality, if we need anything past a dihybrid cross in real life, we just plug it into a computer and we get the answer in a second or so without having to do a lot of filling out a chart. Hopefully this was informative and made sense. I will no doubt get some questions from you in the live Zoom session this week about this material, because you'll have lots of questions about what about this, what about that, with the specific examples. So I look forward to those questions, and hopefully don't cause too much problem in what you believe your family tree to be. Thanks, and have a good day.